Did you and Travolta have any sexual tension while you were filming that movie? High levels of sexual tension. Really? At one point, Debra Winger was regarded as one of the best actors of the 1980s. She was the kind of lady who, with a single look, gesture, or heartfelt statement, could light up the screen. She received 2 Oscar nominations for An Officer and a Gentleman in terms of endearment in a span of only 3 years. Was adored by all of the big directors from Hollywood to Europe, and was likened to icons like Meryl Streep and Jane Fonda. However, she almost disappeared a little more than 10 years later. No terrible role, no public downfall, no dramatic scandal. Hollywood resonated with only one hidden truth. Working with Debra Winger was no longer desirable. She remained silent for years after being labeled tough, conceited, and uncontrollable. No excuses, no interviews to rebuild one's reputation, no concessions. However, the reality is never straightforward, as is the case with many Hollywood truths. Every critique has a backstory. Every icy look conceals a wound that hasn't fully healed. Debra Winger's outbursts were always accompanied by insults that would have hurt anyone else regardless. This essay will discuss the friendships that never materialized, the directors who attempted to silence Debra Winger, the producers who rejected her, the co-stars who harmed her, and the connections that molded and destroyed her career. This is not the tale of an actress who rebels. In a society that only cherished those who answered yes, it tells the tale of a lady who dared to say no. Travolta, John. From affection to a slap that breaks teeth. Debra Winger's breakthrough performance in 1980's Urban Cowboy wasn't the only thing that made her famous in Hollywood. Additionally, it was the first time she had ever been in a passionate yet unstable relationship. John Travolta, a rising star from Saturday Night Fever, co-starred with her. Approachable yet erratic, appealing yet stubborn. Winger knew something was wrong from the moment they met. Travolta didn't begin with a salutation or a straightforward congrats. Rather, he inquired as to whether she was Jewish before asking right away if she had attended college. Fairly innocuous inquiries, but to Winger they held a subliminal bias, a silent judgment, an assessment based on history, education, and looks. Finally, he said something obscenely sexual that she has never said in public. As though the film itself were lured to disorder, something nevertheless kindled in the midst of that initial tension. On the screen, they collided. They turned into a fierce, stormy couple. They started a real poisonous, but intoxicating, romance off-screen. Travolta was told to slap Winger's character in a particular love scene, which is a typical false hit like any other movie take. However, he gave her a real slap when the cameras were rolling. One of her teeth was broken by the force of it. There was simply sorrow, no apologies, no stop to see how she was doing. Both bodily and, worse, emotionally. In an odd turn of events, Travolta asked her to marry him after that slap. Debra Winger declined. No big scene, no long explanation. No, she responded simply. A natural response upon recognizing that the relationship had evolved from desire to dominance and control. She left him and that warped relationship behind. However, she would carry the wounds from that first significant relationship with her throughout her professional life. When questioned about Travolta years later, she answered with silence, the type that comes from someone who has loved, trusted, and been broken in a way that Hollywood never allows anybody to fully recover from, rather than with resentment or affection. The unbreakable brick wall was Richard Gere. Among Debra Winger's most significant artistic accomplishments was An Officer and a Gentleman. She was nominated for an Oscar and was commended by critics for her genuineness and depth of emotion. Yet she spoke candidly about the experience. "I certainly don't love that movie today, and I didn't love it when I was making it." She was to Winger nothing more than a brick wall for her co-star Richard Gere, the man that viewers pictured as charming, restrained, and deep. There was seriousness in that phrase. For years, it came to represent the resistance and separation between two individuals who, despite portraying a famous romantic pair on television, were unable to connect off-screen. Gossip, Louise Jr. subsequently acknowledged in his memoir that Winger and Gere stayed away from one another when the camera wasn't rolling. He played the tough drill instructor. Not even a glimmer of warmth, no interaction, no talks. It was something Richard Gere never disputed. He acknowledged that there was conflict between them in an interview, but he provided no additional context. Winger, however, was much more direct. She admitted to being irritated due to her own acting anxieties, which she frequently vented to her co-stars. Particularly Gere, in an interview with the Daily Mail, "I let it all out on everyone." But it was more than a personal dispute. Behind the camera was where Winger suffered the most severe injuries. She said in an interview with The Telegraph that she was handled like a damaged object by producer Don Simpson and director Taylor Hackford. Simpson, who is notorious for his offensive remarks about women, once blatantly insulted Winger by saying that she wasn't Fable, which is unacceptable even by the standards of 1980s Hollywood. It didn't end there either. The director said her face appeared swollen on screen, so Winger remembered being advised to take diuretics on some days. These were not suggestions from doctors. The folks in the editing room were the source of them. Guys who believed they had the right to treat women like props and control their bodies. Winger was incensed, but she refused to give up. The entire filming process was stopped when she objected to a sequence that she felt compromised the integrity of her character. Taylor Hackford was furious, but after watching the video he had to concede that, from an acting perspective, Winger was spot on. The issue in Hollywood was that, particularly for women, being correct did not always equate to forgiveness. A male actor is a perfectionist when he stops a project because he is unhappy. Winger was called a problem, difficult, and uncontrollable when she did it. Taylor Hackford and Don Simpson, when the bully turns into the producer. Tensions with co-stars like Richard Gere may have been chilly, submissive, and silent when Debra Winger was involved. However, what transpired behind the camera, particularly with producer Don Simpson and director Taylor Hackford, was something much more degrading. A daily loss of dignity that gradually eroded her sense of value. Winger was more than simply an actress showcasing her skills on the set of An Officer and a Gentleman. She was a young lady negotiating a male-dominated society. Nor did those men try to conceal their ambition to control everything, especially her body. Winger once referred to the strong but inflexible director Taylor Hackford as an animal. It wasn't disrespectful. It was the instinctive reaction of someone who had been forced into a difficult situation too often. Despite being the film's emotional core, Winger claimed she was often treated like a second-class performer. However, the most severe injuries weren't caused by those behind the camera. The editing room was where they came from. In front of the entire team, producer Don Simpson, who was notorious for his brutality, vulgarity, and obsession with domineering actresses, once declared that Debra Winger wasn't Fable enough to play the lead. A terrifying insult encased in the objectification and misogyny that have long afflicted the sector. It didn't stop there either. Simpson would watch the footage after every day of filming and conclude that her face was bloated. She required the use of diuretics. No doctor's consultation, no regard for her own comfort. She had to take medication if she didn't appear attractive enough on screen. Debra Winger hadn't remained quiet, she resisted. She once objected to filming a scene because she thought it utterly distorted the character's mental state. For male actors of the day, this gesture of resistance would have been considered standard. Hahowever, it made Winger feel alone in her own movie, and gave her the labels of challenging and problematic. The production delay infuriated director Hackford. Later, however, he had to concede she was correct after re-examining the scene and her justifications. Her perspective is not only emotionally true, but also structurally and psychologically correct. However, that acknowledgement was accompanied by a silent caution rather than an apology. You can't effortlessly manage her. And nothing is more dangerous in Hollywood than an uncontrollable woman. Winger never collaborated with Hackford or Simpson again after that movie. She seldom ever mentioned them in interviews, but when she did, it was like an indictment. "I still remember, I've just decided not to go through that again," Madonna. The path is different, and the league is different. In a poignant tale of women baseball players during World War II, Debra Winger was cast in the lead role of A League of Their Own in the early 1990s. She had a strong belief in the initiative. For 3 months in a row, she trained with the Chicago Cubs, developing her physical stamina, picking up the skills necessary to play the game, and becoming ready to be a true athlete. This was more than simply another part for Winger. It was an earnest dedication to women, history, and the art of acting. And then there was Madonna. Winger remained calm when she learned that the well-known pop singer would be joining the cast. She didn't dispute. She didn't voice her displeasure to the producers or director. She took one action. She left with a straightforward, determined, and unexplained walk. She never directly attacked Madonna, but later told the media, "I felt the film had changed direction from a historical story to something more like an Elvis movie where music and showbiz visuals drown out the original spirit." And that wasn't the kind of film. I think Madonna's film career speaks for itself. No drama, no bitterness, just a sigh from someone who no longer had patience for artistic compromise. Winger didn't leave the film out of pride or jealousy, but when asked about the pop stars acting in the movie, he gave a single icy line that everyone in Hollywood understood perfectly. The film became a huge hit and a beloved part of American pop culture, and she left because she understood that when your heart no longer believes in a project, it no longer deserves your talent or your integrity. Gina Davis took her place, like a master craftsman who looks at inferior materials and decides not to begin. However, Winger had no regrets because, to her, sometimes an actor's absence is the last act of artistry they can perform. Shirley Mlan, a battle that would never be resolved out of all the tense relationships Debra Winger had. None were even close to calling a colleague in real life, but she called a mother on screen. While the film depicted a loving tale of maternal love, the set was a silent battlefield where two strong-willed women fought in every scene, every glance, and every interruption. In terms of endearment, they starred as mother and daughter in 1983, a cinematic masterpiece that won Best Picture at the Oscars and earned both actresses nominations for Best Actress. Upon their initial encounter on the set, Winger arrived in combat boots, a short skirt, and a defiant gaze, while Mlan, who was already a legend with 3 Oscar nominations, arrived in an elegant dress, a fur coat, and the poised aura of old-school Hollywood. Mlan later acknowledged in her memoir, "I saw her and thought, oh my God, it wasn't a judgment." The tension reached its climax when Winger, who is always impetuous and assertive, yelled at Mlan during a take when she missed her mark. It was the instinctual alarm of someone from a different generation. Director James L. Brooks had to admit from the beginning that no one understood their relationship. Not even they. "You hit the mark." Not to be intimidated, Mlan retaliated, "I understand what it is to hit a mark." Winger then left, raised her skirt a little, glanced over her shoulder, and let out a fart in Shirley Mlan's face. This incident was later described by Mlan in her memoir, My Lucky Stars. It was not denied by Winger. "There's something true in that," she remarked with a slight smile on a 2018 talk show when Andy Cohen inquired if the anecdote about farting and licking feet was real. They weren't adversaries who hated one another. Like untamed creatures confined to the same cage, they challenged one another, and only one of them could get out of it unharmed. At least in terms of size. Although it wasn't directed at Winger specifically, the entire crowd recognized the person standing in its shadow as Mlan went onto the stage to deliver the now iconic phrase, "I deserve this," after winning the Oscar. "We didn't eat lunch together, but there was respect," Winger subsequently stated. The kind of respect that boxers share after a vicious battle. You know your opponent has deadly skills, but you never want a rematch. Notwithstanding the passage of nearly 40 years, the public hasn't let it go, and talk programs continue to inquire. Because some conflicts, whether won or lost, never fully heal. John Malkovich, a runway model masquerading as an actor. Debra Winger had worked with a wide range of co-stars by the late 1980s. The media continues to revive it, and each time Winger simply smirks, allowing others to rewrite the story whatever they choose. They range from emotionally unstable screen mothers to physically aggressive lovers. Some charming but toxic, and others so reclusive they felt like strangers. However, in 1990, while working on The Sheltering Sky, she met a new type of partner, John Malkovich, who she bluntly referred to as a runway model, not because he was attractive or because he wore flamboyant clothing, but because, in Winger's words, he appeared to be acting himself rather than the character. To Winger, that was the ultimate transgression. She valued unvarnished, honest acting, unrestrained emotion, and the grounded connection between two individuals in a shared frame. However, Malkovich, with his icy stare, abstract style, and a manner of speaking that sounded like an internal monologue, was totally unnoticeable to her, and she never saw a scene partner in any of the scenes. When asked in one interview what it was like working with Malkovich, Winger didn't hesitate. He was like a runway model, his face was beautiful, his movements were beautiful. But I didn't know who I was talking to. She saw a well-designed display devoid of soul. Others claimed that Winger's outbursts were motivated by jealousy because her co-star didn't interact with her. But those who had collaborated with her knew that it was not surprising because she couldn't tolerate pretense. Rejected audience-facing performances rather than ones that were grounded in character truth. And found The Sheltering Sky, despite director Bernardo Bertolucci's meticulous attention to detail and its richness in philosophical depth and haunting Moroccan landscapes, to be a meaningless experience. Winger never worked with Malkovich again after that film, and she never spoke of him bitterly in later years. He was only a dim glimmer in her memory. It was not because of the script or the cinematography, but because the man who sat across from her every day never really looked her in the eye. In 2 decades in Hollywood, Debra Winger had iconic roles, Oscar nominations, and an audience that loved her for her unvarnished honesty, but she also had something Hollywood rarely tolerated in a woman: ego, intellect, and an unwillingness to comply. She was cold, distant, and heartless, just like the very style of acting she could never accept. Director James Bridges once acknowledged in an interview that he had been so upset with Winger that he had stopped production when she refused to shoot a scene. But after reviewing the film, he had to admit she was entirely correct. For men, those traits are known as independence and artistic vision. For Winger, they became challenging, unfeasible, and dangerous. When the truth was misrepresented, a character was made up, or an actress was exploited as a puppet for male control, Winger simply refused to remain mute. She once remarked, "If a male actor did what I did, they'd call him a perfectionist." Winger didn't rebel against sabotage. However, I was trouble. Women aren't forgiven like that in Hollywood. And Winger knew it well. In 1995, while standing next to her husband in an open field in Ireland, she turned to him and said, "I'm done." There were no regrets, no drama, and no press conference to announce her retirement. People who refuse to bow to directors, leave roles they can't believe in, or speak honestly about over-glorified male stars are not forgiven. Her decision to leave, to be a mother, a wife, a silent observer of the world, to choose small stages over red carpets, to live artfully instead of living for art, came from her realization that the roles being offered were simply worn-out copies of what she had already done. There were no more challenges, no more honest dialogue, and no reason left to keep enduring it. Debra Winger was not a bad girl of Hollywood. She did not destroy sets, fight addiction, or use the press to create myths. She simply never learned how to bow her head, which may be why Hollywood, a culture that values submissive women, never knew how to handle her. Perhaps this is also why she has never been forgotten. Debra Winger did not vanish because she failed. Rather, she left while she was still at the top, when she had options and could refuse, and that was the one thing Hollywood could never forgive, because she did not appease others or conform to the stereotypes of male directors. Debra Winger fought, got hurt, and was pushed aside, but she never betrayed herself. And maybe that's worth more than 3 golden Oscars. She didn't hesitate to offend co-stars, she didn't pretend to be soft in order to get the next role, and she refused to compromise, which was her greatest transgression in a field that relies heavily on compliance. Winger fought that battle decades ago alone, without social media, without allies, without a hashtag campaign. But now, the world finally understands as more young actresses start to speak up about unfairness, the pressure to keep quiet, and how their image and dignity are controlled. If anyone is wondering why Debra Winger was never adored in the film industry, ask them this. Was it because she was too challenging? Or because she dared to say what others were afraid to? And what about you? If you were Debra Winger, torn between freedom and fame, what would you choose? Tell us in the comments. Don't forget to hit follow if this story inspired you to think so you don't miss the next brave, rebellious person we bring to the spotlight.